The year was 1945, and the Pacific Theater lay in a strange, trembling silence, the kind that appears only when a great empire is collapsing under the weight of its own impossible dreams. Heat shimmered across the battered runways of Luzon as American transport trucks rolled into the newly secured POW reception zone, carrying not ordinary prisoners but the once untouchable elite of the Imperial Japanese Army. Their uniforms were stained, their boots frayed, their eyes hollow yet stubbornly alert, as if refusing to accept what history had already decided for them. These were men who had commanded battalions, signed death orders, and marched through conquered cities. Now they stood stripped of power, watching smoke drift from American field kitchens like a taunt from another world. Among them was a senior officer whose back remained impossibly straight despite the hunger that carved deep shadows along his cheekbones. His medals had been taken, his sword confiscated, but his posture clung to dignity the way a drowning man clings to the last floating plank. Around him, other officers shifted uncomfortably, not because of fear. Most had already accepted captivity, but because of the unfamiliar sensation of being observed without reverence. For years, their presence had commanded bowed heads and rigid salutes. Here, American guards watched them with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and something dangerously close to amusement. The sun beat down mercilessly, illuminating every crease in their uniforms, every tremor in their exhausted hands, as if nature itself had joined in exposing their defeated pride. News of Japan's collapsing front had reached them in scattered fragments during their retreat across the archipelago. Rumors of starvation in Tokyo, ration lines stretching into the night, and soldiers collapsing during forced marches haunted their thoughts. Many of these officers had not tasted proper bread in months, surviving instead on thin rice porridge, sweet potatoes, and whatever foraged roots they could stomach. Hunger had stripped their bodies, but it was humiliation that gnawed at their spirits. The imperial code had promised them honor until death. Instead, they found themselves herded into orderly American camps where even the efficiency of defeat felt like an insult. The guards' calm voices, the organized distribution of water, and the medical tents standing ready, all contrasted painfully with the chaotic withdrawal they had barely survived. As they marched deeper into the camp, dust swirling around their ankles, the officers exchanged brief, silent glances. Pride kept their expressions rigid, but their stomachs betrayed them with low, audible growls. An American sergeant noticed, offering a faint smirk before turning to shout instructions at the kitchen crew. Behind the wire fences, the clang of metal trays and the hiss of boiling water created a rhythm strangely comforting after weeks of chaos. Some officers tried to ignore the smells drifting through the air: beef fat, toasted flour, something sweet they could not identify, but instinct won. Their eyes kept wandering toward the mess area, following every movement of the cooks as if tracking an enemy position. A few swallowed hard, pretending it was the heat and not longing. In the shade of a makeshift tent, a medical orderly recorded each officer's name and rank with quiet professionalism. The officers answered stiffly, clinging to formality as a final shield against disgrace. Yet even as they spoke, something inside them shifted. The Americans were not cruel. They were not mocking. They were simply efficient, almost indifferent, and that indifference stung more than open hostility ever could. For the first time, these men felt what it meant to be small in a world that no longer revolved around the emperor's commands. The orderly's pen scratched across the paper with steady strokes, marking the officer's transition from feared adversaries to mere entries in a ledger of war's aftermath. Each recorded name felt like a quiet verdict. But beneath the silence of processing and paperwork, another tension simmered, one more human than military. Hunger had become a constant companion, a dull ache that blurred thoughts and softened even the hardest convictions. As the officers were guided toward the designated barracks, the air thickened with the unmistakable aroma of fresh food drifting from the American mess lines. It was not the thin, desperate scent of survival rations but something richer, warmer, almost luxurious. The officers slowed their steps. A few inhaled deeply, forgetting to hide the gesture. One murmured to another in a low voice, recalling childhood memories of tasting bread during pre-war celebrations. Another wiped his brow, though the heat was no longer the culprit. Something subtle yet profound unfolded then, a quiet breaking of the wall they had built around their pride. They did not speak of surrender, nor of shame. They spoke only of food, of sustenance, of the simple human desire to feel whole again. And though none dared voice it aloud, a shared question rose within them, unbidden and fragile, preparing to rewrite the fragile balance between victor and vanquished. The morning light settled gently over the camp, a soft gold that did nothing to ease the tension coiled around the newly arrived Japanese officers. They moved in small clusters, silent in the way men become when pride is the only possession they have left. The scent from the American mess hall drifted across the yard again, warm, rich, unmistakably foreign, and for a long while the officers stood still, simply letting the aroma settle into their bones. Hunger had a way of stripping away ceremony, and though their faces remained controlled, their eyes betrayed a truth none wished to acknowledge. The senior officer who had held himself like a pillar the day before felt a tremor pass through his hollow frame. His men waited behind him, hands clasped behind their backs, attempting dignity even as their ribs pressed against worn fabric. A young American supply sergeant watched them from a distance, leaning against a stack of wooden crates. His posture was relaxed, but his curiosity sharpened as he observed how the group hovered near the boundary of the mess area without crossing it. The Japanese officers did not argue, did not demand, did not even approach. They simply stood, staring at the steam rising from metal pots as if staring into a memory. The sergeant had seen hunger before, but this was different. This was hunger wrapped in formality, in years of discipline that forbade the simplest human expression. He straightened, sensing the moment tightening like a string pulled too close to breaking. One of the officers finally stepped forward, his boots pressing softly into the dirt, and with a shallow bow motion to the sergeant. The officer's English was fragile, carefully assembled from training manuals and wartime necessity. His voice wavered, but his posture remained formal. "If possible," he said, each syllable deliberate, "may we have bread?" The sergeant blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. Bread? Not extra rations, not special treatment, not anything extravagant, just bread. A few nearby American cooks exchanged glances, half amused, half startled by the simplicity of the request. Bread was abundant in the camp, a staple so common that no one thought twice about it. Yet the way the officer asked made it sound like he was requesting something rare, almost sacred. The sergeant studied the man's face, noting the subtle tremor in his jaw and the exhaustion lining his eyes. This was not a strategic request. This was desperation wrapped in manners. He nodded slowly, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Yeah, we got bread," he replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. But as he turned to relay the request, something inside him shifted. Maybe it was the rigid dignity in the officer's voice, or the idea that men who once commanded thousands were now asking for bread like school children begging for a treat. Whatever it was, it lingered with him as he strode into the kitchen. The cooks listened with raised eyebrows before breaking into quiet murmurs. The head cook wiped his hands on a towel and asked, half smiling, "Bread's all they want." Another man chuckled. "Hell, we can do better than bread." A ripple of unexpected generosity passed through the kitchen, not out of mockery, but out of a strange, human instinct to offer more than requested. They fired up the grill. Thick cuts of beef hit the hot metal with a sharp hiss, sending up a cloud of savory steam. Butter melted across iron pans, crackling around slices of fresh bread. Cheese softened into golden pools between layers of toasted crust. The cooks moved with a coordinated rhythm, their hands sure and efficient, transforming simple ingredients into something far beyond the officer's expectations. Outside, the Japanese prisoners watched the activity with growing uncertainty. Bread did not require fire. Bread did not require this much noise or motion. A few exchanged uneasy glances. The senior officer felt his heartbeat quicken, unsure whether this moment was mercy, mockery, or something else entirely. When the sergeant returned with the first tray, a hush fell over the yard. The tray carried not plain bread but plates of steak, grilled sandwiches, and thick slices of toast glistening with butter. For a moment, the officers did not move. Their code had prepared them for interrogation, humiliation, even brutality. But not this. The senior officer stepped forward slowly, his breath catching as he stared at the meal. It smelled of warmth, of nourishment, of a world no longer collapsing around them. He bowed, deeper this time, the gesture weighted with quiet disbelief. The sergeant shifted awkwardly, unsure how to respond to such formal gratitude. "It's just food," he muttered, though the words felt clumsy against the weight of the moment. One officer reached for a sandwich with trembling fingers. Another inhaled sharply, the scent alone threatening to unravel the thin layer of composure he still clung to. They ate in silence at first, each bite illuminating the hollow spaces inside them. The taste was overwhelming, not merely because it was rich or unfamiliar, but because it broke something inside their pride. For months they had been fed propaganda painting Americans as barbaric machines of war. Yet here they were, being offered comfort instead of cruelty. A quiet or rippled through them, softening their rigid shoulders, loosening the grip of old convictions. Across the yard, American guards watched, their expressions shifting from amusement to curiosity to something like respect. The sergeant folded his arms, still studying the officers with a puzzled frown. He hadn't expected gratitude this profound, nor the way the moment seemed to dissolve the invisible wall standing between enemy and victor. But even as the officers ate, an unspoken question curled into the air around them, something fragile yet unavoidable. What would such unexpected mercy awaken inside men who had been taught that surrender was worse than death? Steam rose from the plates like a soft veil, carrying with it a scent so unfamiliar, so impossibly comforting, that several of the Japanese officers lowered their gaze as if afraid the fragrance alone might break the last fragile threads of their discipline. The senior officer held his fork delicately, fingertips trembling despite the iron self-control he had maintained through years of war. When he finally cut into the steak, the tender fibers parted so easily that he paused, stunned by the simplicity of the moment. A man who had weathered jungles, starvation, and the collapse of an empire found himself shaken not by violence but by the softness of cooked beef under a metal utensil. He lifted the bite to his mouth, chewing slowly, reverently, a faint warmth spreading across his gaunt features as though taste itself had awakened a memory he had forgotten how to feel. Around him, the other officers ate in silence, each quietly surrendering to the strange, disarming comfort of the meal. For months their food had been little more than a ritual of survival. Thin rice, wilted greens, watery broth. Now butter seeped into toasted bread, melting against their lips with a richness they had not known since the early years of the war. One officer closed his eyes as he bit into a grilled sandwich, the crisp exterior giving way to a soft, warm interior. He remained still for a moment, swallowing not just food but the lump of emotion rising in his throat. It wasn't the meal itself that moved him, it was the impossibility of such generosity from those he had been taught to fear. Across the yard, the American guards watched, their earlier amusement dissolving into quiet reflection. They had expected hunger. They had expected awkward gratitude. But they had not anticipated this deep, almost spiritual silence, as though the officers were engaging in a private ceremony rather than simply eating breakfast. The young sergeant scratched the back of his neck, feeling oddly protective of these men who had been his enemies only days before. He had fought long enough to know that hunger could turn even the proudest soldier into a ghost of himself. Yet something about the officer's careful, solemn way of eating stirred an unfamiliar respect within him. He found himself stepping back, giving them space, as if he had intruded upon a sacred rite. The senior officer finished his first bite and lowered his fork, inhaling the scent of butter and seared meat that clung to the air. He had spent years teaching young soldiers that Americans were crude, barbaric monsters who thrived on brutality. But looking now at the steaming plates, at the sergeant standing several paces away with hands politely clasped, he felt the first crack appear in the stone walls of his belief. Humility settled over him like a gentle ache. He lifted another bite, not hurried but deliberate, aware that each mouthful softened a part of him he had kept locked away behind doctrine and discipline. As they ate, the officers exchanged glances, brief, uncertain, but undeniably human. No words passed between them, yet their expressions carried the same message. The world they had known no longer existed. They had come expecting punishment or at least indifference. Instead, they were being fed with a generosity that bordered on unsettling. One officer bowed his head slightly after finishing his plate, as though offering thanks not merely for the food, but for the unexpected dignity it had granted him. His companion beside him stared at the crumbs left on his tray, his jaw tight with emotion he refused to express. The myths that had shaped their understanding of the enemy were fracturing, dissolving under the warmth of a meal they had never imagined receiving. The American cooks observed them from the open kitchen tent, their earlier joking eased into a quiet appreciation. One lifted a hand in a subtle gesture of acknowledgement when the senior officer glanced their way. The officer dipped his head in return, a small movement, but one laden with meaning. It was the first time he had shown anything resembling deference to an American. The gesture did not go unnoticed. The sergeant felt the shift in the air, a subtle recalibration of roles and expectations. Respect was taking root in soil once hardened by propaganda. Food had become the unlikely catalyst for transformation. Each bite eroded the officer's rigid perceptions, revealing a vulnerability they could no longer disguise. For some, this vulnerability felt like shame, a reminder of the gulf between the world they had fought for and the world they now inhabited. For others, it was a quiet relief, the realization that defeat did not necessarily strip them of their humanity. In the quiet clink of utensils and the soft murmur of the American cooks cleaning their pans, a new understanding took shape, fragile yet unmistakably real. As the meal ended, the officers set down their trays with care, as though afraid to disturb the tenuous peace that had settled over them. Their bodies felt steadier, their faces less gaunt, but something deeper had shifted, an internal loosening of the knots tied by years of fear and indoctrination. The senior officer rose slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He bowed once more, deeper this time, not as a gesture of surrender, but as an acknowledgement of unexpected humanity. The sergeant watched as the officers filed back toward their barracks, their steps firmer, their postures subtly altered. He sensed that something significant had occurred, though he could not name it. What he did know was that food had done what weapons could not. It had dismantled a myth. Yet as the officers disappeared into the afternoon light, a new question lingered in the sergeant's mind, unsettling and profound, for he could not help wondering how this simple act of kindness might ripple outward into a world still reeling from war. When the sun rose the next morning, its light spilled gently across the camp, illuminating faces that looked subtly changed. The Japanese officers emerged from their barracks with a posture less strained, their movements steadier than the day before. They had slept more deeply than any of them expected, their bodies no longer fighting the relentless ache of hunger. Yet it wasn't the meal alone that lingered within them, it was the bewildering kindness behind it. The senior officer paused at the doorway, his gaze sweeping across the camp with a contemplative heaviness, as though he was seeing it for the first time, without the lens of indoctrination. His thoughts drifted uneasily between memory and revelation, between the promises of his empire and the unexpected humanity of the enemy, who had replaced his sword with a tray of food. As they walked toward roll call, the American guards observed them with a curious shift in demeanor. The young sergeant who had first answered their request noticed the subtle lightness in their steps. Something about their bearing, still dignified but no longer brittle, struck him. He felt an odd sense of responsibility, as if the previous day's small act had tied him to these men in a way that transcended uniforms and allegiances. When the officers approached, the sergeant offered a simple nod, nothing more. Yet the senior officer returned it with measured sincerity, an acknowledgement neither of them would have imagined offering a week earlier. Later that morning, the officers gathered beneath the shade of a canvas awning, where they were handed paper forms documenting health status and camp regulations. Ordinary routine, yet each stroke of the pen felt strangely momentous. These same hands had once signed battle directives, strategic withdrawals, even final letters for soldiers who never returned. Now they signed documents accepting rations, medical checks, and work rotations. The senior officer lingered over one line longer than necessary. Cooperative behavior will be met with fair treatment. He knew fair treatment when he saw it now. It had arrived on a plate the day before, steaming, fragrant, disarming. As the hours passed, the officers found themselves engaged in conversations they would have once dismissed as impossible. While collecting their noon rations, one of them asked the cooks, hesitantly, in halting English, how the sandwiches were made. The cooks exchanged amused glances, but explained the basics with patient gestures. Butter, grill, flip, serve. The officer listened as though absorbing tactical instructions. For a moment, both sides forgot the war entirely. They were simply men discussing food under a patch of tropical sky. The young sergeant watched this interaction from across the yard, struck by how swiftly walls could crumble when hunger, humility, and unexpected mercy converged. He had enlisted believing the enemy was a faceless mass, a force of fanatic brutality. Yet here he saw individuals, tired, proud, uncertain, grappling with a world that had turned itself inside out. He wondered what they had been told about Americans. He wondered what it felt like to have those myths shatter in a single meal. The senior officer, meanwhile, felt a different kind of rumbling inside him, not hunger now, but a dawning recognition of responsibility. He had spent years teaching young soldiers that death in battle was preferable to capture, that surrender was not merely defeat but disgrace. And yet here he stood, alive, fed, respected in small but unmistakable ways. Did that make him a failure of his own code? Or had the code itself been built on illusions too fragile to survive real human contact? As he watched the cooks laughing softly among themselves, he felt a sharp, unexpected ache in his chest, regret, perhaps, or something adjacent to it. That afternoon, the American camp commander arrived for an inspection. A stern, orderly man with silver threaded through his hair, he observed the Japanese officers with careful attention. Their improved appearance did not escape him. When he reached the senior officer, he stopped, studying the man's posture, upright, solemn, yet edged with something new. For several seconds they simply regarded each other. Then the commander offered a simple statement, delivered without condescension. "You'll be treated fairly here. That's our promise." The senior officer bowed, not mechanically but with genuine gratitude. The commander inclined his head slightly in response, recognizing the depth of the gesture. In the days that followed, subtle changes rippled quietly through the camp. The officers began participating more willingly in daily routines, not out of obedience to the victors, but out of a renewed sense of structure they had lost in the chaos of collapse. Some even engaged in brief exchanges with the guards, questions about weather, about rations, about the strange, humming generator that powered the clinic tent. Each interaction chipped away at the remnants of animosity that clung to them like dust. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the senior officer stood alone near the fence, watching shadows stretch across the ground. The faint aroma of dinner drifted from the kitchen once more, stirring memories of that first overwhelming meal. He thought of the empire he had served, of the promises of honor and sacrifice, and of the crushing violence that had shadowed every victory. He thought of the simple act of Americans preparing steak for their enemies, and the way it had forced him to confront truths he had never dared examine. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a world where enemies might choose restraint over revenge, where mercy could echo longer than fear. The thought unsettled him, yet he could not deny its power. It rooted itself quietly inside him, altering the contours of his loyalty and reshaping the landscape of his understanding. As night settled, he turned from the fence and walked toward the barracks with slow, deliberate steps. The camp lights flickered awake, casting long beams across the yard. Somewhere behind him, an American guard called out to another, their voices low and unguarded. Ahead of him, his men waited, hungry not for food now, but for direction. He felt the weight of their expectation and the weight of his own awakening balancing precariously in his chest. And in that fragile space between dusk and darkness, one undeniable truth took shape. Mercy had pierced deeper than any blade, and the consequences of that mercy were only beginning to unfold. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.